Okay, welcome everyone to the second installment in our research education series. I'm happy to have Christina Cooper with us today. She's a senior compliance specialist in the Office of Compliance, and she's going to talk about compliance and conflict of interest. She's done this lecture once before. We had some good conversations about this. It's probably one of the most misunderstood topics is sort of in your research process. The other thing I'll put in an advertisement on May the 21st, Carly Emerson will be talking about the Institutional Review Board with Janet McDowell. So Christina, thanks for presenting.
Thank you. So I guess good afternoon now. As Dr. Farrell said, my name is Christina Cooper, and I work in the Organizational Integrity and Compliance Department. I've been asked to speak with you today about compliance and conflicts of interest as it relates to research projects. Feel free to ask questions throughout, or there will be time. I believe the people on the phone are muted, so there should be time at the end if you have any questions about anything discussed. So to begin off, I do not have any conflicts of interest with this presentation. Some of the objectives that we have for today is that we're hopefully by the end of this you'll be able to recognize key components of a research compliance program and be able to recognize what it takes to have a compliant research program at Carilion. We'll also be able to define what is considered research misconduct, how to report any concerns that you may come across. And finally, probably the most important would be applying the policies and procedures that we have in place here in regards to research conflicts of interest. So in order to do this, our agenda today will be broken up into three separate parts: research compliance, integrity and misconduct, so what you should be doing and what you shouldn't be doing as far as research is concerned, and then conflicts of interest. So the first thing that comes to mind usually when you're doing your research projects is usually not compliance. So typically people get introduced to research either through students, if you're an undergrad, even I who have a BA, have to do some research projects as a student. But if we're doing it as either a clinician or within our scope in healthcare, typically it's a question that you have come across that you want to have answered. In order to do that, the most important thing usually we think of is good science, making sure it's worth your time and it's valuable, that it can contribute to generalizable knowledge. There's also getting funding, so your grant writing, applying for NIH or other grants can be a job in and of itself. And then also lab management. So if we're doing human subject research, we want to make sure that we have the right population in place, that we are capable of doing our studies. If it's lab, that you have the resources, you have the time, effort, things like that. So when that comes into play, sometimes compliance will fall to the wayside. And it's easy to understand why it can be so confusing to have research compliance. These are just a few fun acronyms in research that are regulatory acts and agencies that may be have additional regulations that you have to follow and comply with. And as principal investigators, that typically falls under you. So key research personnel, obviously it's very important that you make sure that you're complying with rules, but when it comes down to it, it really is the responsibility of the principal investigator, and that can be pretty daunting if you see this list. So that is where we come in. So the role of compliance in research, we do have a research oversight committee here at Carilion. It is made up of 4 different areas: research and development, institutional review board, the health analytics research team, and then my team, which is organizational integrity and compliance. So the first 3 are typically focused on research here at Carilion. Compliance falls in as sort of a checks and balance. So the first 3 you can kind of think of as operational. How do you get your research going? How do you maintain it? And how do you keep it going in a compliant manner? Integrity and compliance, we fit in as a checks and balance of that system to make sure that everything is in place that needs to be. More specifically, these are the areas of responsibility within my department. Privacy office is in my department, so HIPAA, anything that relates to that. Information data security, once you get your data, how do you obtain it? Do you obtain it correctly? Once you have it, where do you keep it? And also, how do you share it? Auditing and monitoring, this is something that is a responsibility. Internal audit is also part of my organizational integrity and compliance department. So we do utilize the auditing and monitoring of your studies. Protocol non-compliance, we work with the IRB, so if they come across something, typically continuing review time, you may see something that doesn't comply with what the protocol said that you should have been doing. That may be a time where it's brought up. If that happens, we are notified. The Chief Compliance Officer, Ms. Vicki Clevenger, is mandated to report these to different institutions and the board, so that falls through our office as well. Research integrity, again, what you should be doing as part of your research. Research misconduct, and we'll go in through that in a little bit. And also conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest for all Carilion Clinic employees comes through my office, and not just through research. So the first thing I'll talk about is research integrity. This is what you should be doing to make sure that the safeguards are in place in order to make sure that your research really is to the best of your subjects' welfare, that your data is secure, that it is unbiased, and that we are able to hopefully make a difference. So some examples of research integrity is reporting both positive and negative results. This has been coming up a lot more recently, that typically when people join a research project, either you hear in the news, you hear if stuff goes really, really bad, or you hear mostly breakthroughs, things that go really, really good. We don't ever get those things that are kind of in between. Sometimes, a lot of times, actually, research subjects are not aware of what happens once they join a study. They know what happens to them if they had any results, but they don't know what happened overall. And so it's becoming more and more of a requirement. ClinicalTrials.gov, for example, is requesting results to be posted. So it's not anymore that you just post on clinical trials so that people can find your study, but you need to be able to give them updates in real time of what is happening. Providing true and accurate and complete costs related to your research or grant-sponsored funding. So you are a steward of that money. You're being given that money in hopes that you use it wisely and appropriately. And so making sure that we're spending it on what we say we're going to spend it on the research that we say that we're using, and making sure that it's not being used elsewhere is really important. And also providing credit where credit is due. So if somebody has worked on your project and has helped you but has not been listed maybe in publications, that is something that we really are trying to focus more on, is making sure that the people that are truly doing the research are the ones that are receiving the credit for it. So research misconduct. So the definition of it is fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, or reviewing research, or in reporting your research results. So fabrication is you completely did not do the study, you made up everything that was involved with it. Falsification, maybe you did the study, but you have either omitted some of your data or you have modified it to fit your need. And plagiarism, obviously, is you're taking somebody else's ideas or processes and placing them as your own. It is important with research misconduct to realize that it does not include honest error. So if you accidentally omit that data set and it skews your numbers, but that was not in any intentional way, that does not qualify as a research misconduct. Also, differences in opinion. So your reading of your analysis of your study may be different from somebody else in your study. That difference in opinion does not mean that that person is completing research misconduct. Some examples that I've come across. So taking authorship credit for research participation, that was in name only. So a lot of times if you're just starting out in research, maybe you want to get papers out there to advance your career. you do some of the grunt work or you don't do some of the grunt work, you get somebody else that's more knowledgeable, you reach out to them, get some information, maybe they've done a similar study in the past. Instead of citing them, you say that they can be an author on the paper. That is considered misconduct. Failure to provide validation for your research. This is also becoming a big issue. So it's great if you have these big breakthroughs, but nobody else can replicate your research. This is becoming more and more a requirement when you're having published articles to make sure that somebody can indeed validate that your research was done the way that you claim it has been done. As well as self-plagiarism. So you can plagiarize yourself. So if you do manage to get your research published, typically when you do that, you're signing away parts of that ownership. So if it's copyrighted within that magazine article and then you go to have somebody else publish it, it's under copyright laws. So that could be potentially self-plagiarism. So when we see research misconduct, it's important to be able to say something, and it doesn't come across a whole lot, luckily, here. But there are times where people may have questions about something that is going on. If you do, it's okay and completely appropriate to ask your supervisor or department chair to look into it or ask them questions. If they are involved or you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can always reach out to my office. So we have a website, email address that you can reach out and it'll be directed in the appropriate direction. Typically, if it's research involved, it comes to me first. And then we also have the Integrity Helpline, which can also be used for research questions. So that is by a third party. It is independent, so you can remain anonymous if you want to. It does help us to be able to get more information if we do have your name, but you can remain anonymous if you would like. And there's phone numbers and an email address. And these are also on your desktop of any Correllian computer. So anytime you have a question, it's much better if we are the ones that do the investigation. That's sort of our role. So a lot of times people will see something, they might want to investigate themselves, and then they find themselves getting involved. And that can lead to problems. So it's just best if we do. All right. So here's the biggie. So conflicts of interest. So what is considered a conflict of interest? So basically it's a situation when an investigator or their family member, financial, professional, or personal considerations that are directly or indirectly may affect or reasonably appear to affect the investigator's professional judgment in performing a Correllian clinic duty or responsibility. So basically this means if you have two interests, one personal, one is part of your Correllian role, and there may be a potential conflict between those two, that is something that needs to be disclosed. The important thing to remember with conflicts of interest is that they can be actual apparent or potential. So they don't have to necessarily be at the time a conflict, but it could be something where it could be perceived to be. Who needs to disclose? So key research personnel on your study. So that is anybody, including principal investigator, but anybody regardless of their position or title who's responsible for design, conduct, or reporting of actual proposed research. This includes students, study nurses, pharmacists if they are involved. Say it's a double-blind, random controlled, where they are the ones responsible for choosing who gets what drug, then your pharmacist could be considered key research personnel. So when do you need to disclose? So it's a requirement for a certain level at Correllian to have an annual review. All key research personnel typically, if no later than 30 days after discovery. So once a study is about to begin, or if a study has been going on but you've got a new source of funding, no later than 30 days of that needs to be disclosed to my office. Also when you're adding new personnel as well. So if you have a study that's been going on that everybody has completed the conflict of interest disclosure, it's either been cleared or there's a management plan in place, but you have somebody new coming in, that person needs to be added on through filling out and disclosure form. So how do you know if you need to disclose? So typically anything that is externally funded or supported needs to be disclosed regardless of the sponsor and regardless of monetary value. So typically a lot of people think of conflicts of interest. It is a requirement if it's federal funding, but here at Carilion we require it for anything, so industry sponsored included. It also doesn't have a monetary value, so sometimes it's not money, sometimes it could be you getting a free device, or you're getting the study drug for free. Those things need to be reported as well. How do we find out? So typically my office is in close relationship with the R&D office, so feasibility meetings, when those are scheduled, I'm invited to those. If we find out about grants, I work with the grants team to make sure that we have information on that, and external institutions. So if it's something where we're working with multiple sites, we can work with that different institution to make sure that their conflict of interest is either being followed or ours is being followed by their investigators. So what needs to be disclosed? So employment, that includes your family members. So say you have a study that's being sponsored by Pfizer and your wife works for Pfizer, we would need to have that disclosed to us, even if it's not for the study drug that you are using. Consulting services, this comes up a lot. This is probably our most common. Either you're on an advisory board for a pharmaceutical company, you've been asked to speak at a speakers bureau for them, you're a preceptor, anything like that has to be reported. Proprietary interest, so if you have a device that you're studying that you're going to sell to somebody else and you want intellectual property rights, or have a patent in place for it, any copyrights, royalties, things like that needs to be disclosed. Financial benefits, if you have any current or proposed, so say they say if this study goes great, we'll give you more funding for your next project, that would need to be disclosed as well. Incentives, so anything for reimbursement for enrolling so many per study, anything that is any kind of incentive to get enrollment or recruitment, those need to be told, and reimbursement for travel. So this is also one of our typical ones. So we usually say if you have to be involved in an investigator meeting for a study, that if it's a part of your clinical trial agreement, that it's in place that this is truly something that is necessary in order for you to participate in the research. Those are typically fine, but we do ask that they be disclosed. If you get a trip to Bermuda, those would probably be declined, sorry to say. So where do you go to disclose COI? So at Carilion Clinic, we use COI Smart software. It is a website. Carilion Clinic, you can use your Active Directory. So it would be anything that you would use to get into Epic or your email. That is going to be your login information for our external collaborators that are working under our conflict of interest plan. Then they have a different one. They don't have an AD account, so we give them a login and a password to get into the system, and then they can change it themselves. So why do you need to disclose? So this is a requirement for any federally funded research under the 42 CFR Part 50 and 45 CFR Part 94. It is also a requirement of FDA, so if you have any FDA-sponsored studies, so drugs and devices, they are under 21 CFR Part 54. And then Carilion Clinic's policy. So this is very common for large institutions that do a lot of research to make it across the board. So kind of like when we do our IRB is responsible for federally funded research, making sure that its human subject is safe and falls under those regulations of the common rule. But most IRBs and most institutions kind of do what we call the check the box. So they do it for any kind of study, regardless of if it's got a sponsor or if it's investigator initiated. Same goes for conflict of interest. It just makes it easier for us to be able to comply with all these rules. Should you sometime, hopefully, be able to get some federal funding for your study, you're already following under those same guidelines. This is what I get asked mostly. Seriously, why every study? So It is frustrating. I do get it. Why do you have to fill it out for every study that you participate in, particularly if you participate in a lot? This COI policy now is study specific, it's not sponsor specific. So if you have a study with Pfizer, I don't know why I'm picking on Pfizer, I always pick on Pfizer. If you have 2 studies with Pfizer, one that you are a preceptor for maybe, that you're more familiar with that drug than other people, you go to other places, you know how to do the IV the best, I don't know. But you are responsible for it for one study, but you're not for the other drug. It is study specific, so we would have a different management plan in place for your one that you are more responsible for than the one that you're just using the same sponsor, but that you don't have any personal relationship or personal conflicting interest with. We ask for this for better transparency, so that we know that for sure that you are. Typically you fill out your annual in October, or when you get hired on. It may now be August. It's been a long time. It's almost coming back around again. This is just making sure that you do realize what you have included and what you haven't. And because it is study specific, then we know when. And that is responsible for time frame requirements. So we have the 30-day notice. That is a federal funded requirement. The same that we have these time frames that we know exactly when it started, when you were having this potential conflict, and it makes it easier for us to be able to manage it. Confirmation of roles and responsibilities. This is something that I did not necessarily see coming when we started this program, but I've been seeing it a lot. So you may have been asked to start a study or be a part of a study months and months ago, but sometimes it takes a long time to get those contracts in place. You may have been promised or asked to do something specifically at that point, but now that we're coming up on it, those things may change or they may adjust, and you may not be aware of something. So maybe you were promised some equity, or you were promised royalties or IP or funding. Those things may change. So it's important that if we have that information, that we know for sure exactly what it is happening, what your role is, and what your responsibilities are, and that you know those as well. And this also complies with our external affiliations. So with anybody so Virginia Tech, for example, or UVA, that this complies with their conflict of interest policies, makes it easier for us to be able to do multi-site studies. And then the most important thing, I think, is that this is a new method. It's not a new concept. So prior to the COI SMART program, we did have a research financial disclosure form that you did have to fill out for every study that was externally funded. Typically WERB required it. So it was in paper. You had to fill it out. It was, I think, 6 questions. Our form is 8 questions, and the 2 extra additional questions are: what is your sponsor, and what are you studying, and what is your role? Those are the only things that are completely separate from what you previously filled out. So this isn't anything new. It's a new way to look at it. It's a new method, and it complies both with and collaborates with our new, not only our new IRB, but our R&D has a new electronic form. So it just makes it all electronic and up into new technology.
Christina, do you want to talk a little bit more about that with the role of COI in the PRISM application?
As far as that you can't fill out your form. So typically we ask that, so we are the first step in your IRB process. So if you're doing a human subject research study, it's going through PRISM, through our IRB. The IRB requires that you have your conflict of interest forms filled out prior to submitting to the IRB. That way it's not on their timeline, because they don't want to have something that they're having to hold on to that they can't do anything with until you have done your due diligence and reporting the form. So I do see, I'm the first step, so I do see it when you do submit to the IRB, and I can see if you have any external funding that somehow has bypassed either the feasibility or R&D, or somehow you managed to miraculously just show up with this study. I do see it, but it does hold it up if you don't have your forms.
So in summary, you can put a hard stop on an IRB application. Yes.
Yes. We don't like the word hard stop, but I am, yes, I'm the beginning of the process. And it just makes it easier, as sometimes people ask about conflicts of interest. Why does that have to be right in the beginning? The IRB can't approve a study if it doesn't have, if you say you have a conflict and it needs to have a management plan in place. They can't approve your documents until that management plan is already happening, and then they can agree upon it, or they can make it more stringent. So it is just important that it comes through our office first. So how is your disclosure reviewed once you give it? And so it's evaluated by the Chief Compliance Officer, again, Vicki Clevenger, or her designee, typically me, to determine if COI exists for research. So if there is a potential conflict of interest, your key stakeholders, so that would be either like your department chair, chief legal counsel, if it has something to do with IPs or royalties or something where legal might have to be involved. They can be consulted, as well as the institutional official. So Dr. Harrington has to sign off on all research that takes place at Carilion, so he would be involved in your research plan, or your management plan, excuse me, as well as you. So we do make, if you are the person that has the conflict, we do make you a part of the process, because you have to agree to whether you're going to, how you're going to manage it. And so we get you involved before it goes to the IRB for them to do a final approval. So here's some management plan examples. Public disclosure of the conflict of interest. So we follow the PHS guidelines for public disclosure. So it has to be on a either publicly accessed website. So we have ours on the Carilion website that the public can see. It is very broad, so it doesn't give exactly what you're getting or what the conflict is, but it gives sort of the relationship in general, and then some monetary amounts in various forms. Disclosure and included in the consent form. This is our most common, so this may be something that we require. It may be something the sponsor required. We've had several where the sponsor is asked. Maybe if you are a preceptor or you're part of their speakers bureau, that you disclose that within their consent form. So it typically gives, that way it gives sort of a better autonomy for the subject to make sure that they really want to participate, regardless of whether you have a different personal interest in the study. Modification of the research study, and change of personnel responsibilities. So this typically would be if you're the one that has the conflict, maybe you're not the one that is allowed to consent to patients, subjects. So we may ask somebody else to be in there. It may be monitored. We might do, if it's a high-risk study, or the management plan includes auditing or monitoring of the study, that may be somebody coming in and being present at the time of consenting patients. And then the reduction or elimination of the financial interest or severance of relationships. So either you have this relationship that we can't manage, it's just going to be too much of a conflict. We may ask you to either not do the study or to reduce your personal interest. So if that is royalties, stock in that company, something like that, we may ask you to either switch that or not do the study, give the study to somebody else to be responsible for. But that is a very rare occasion, and we haven't had that happen here as well. We usually, typically, we want you to do your research, and we would like you to have funding for your research. So we're really trying not to make it difficult, but we just want to make sure that it is the most compliant that it can be. And I think the key takeaway with COI, so a lot of times people are afraid to disclose things, or they think, oh, I'm not going to be able to do my research if I disclose what this is. And it's important to say that it's not necessarily mean if you have a conflict or you have something that you need to disclose, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do your research or it's going to affect it in any way. That it's averse to regulatory requirements. We really do want to make sure that you're able to do your research if you can in any way possible. That is also making sure that it's mostly transparent to people, that people are aware and they have the choice whether they want to be included in the study or not. So it's really important. The most minor, again, we have what we consider a zero threshold. So again, there's that no monetary amount, and it doesn't matter who the sponsor is. So if it's anything externally funded, it does need to be disclosed. Typically, if we get that, we can clear it if it's not anything that has a conflict with your professional study taking place. And if it does, then we typically are able to do a management plan to make sure that you're still able to do your study. Does anybody here have any questions? Yeah.
There's been a couple of occasions where I've sort of listened to people presenting their studies, and they use terms like no conflict related to this.
The conference is now in talk mode.
And I just wonder what that means from the viewpoint of compliance and things like that. And if you've got a conflict, then whether it, let's say I'm presenting something and I'm going to talk about a drug that's made by company A, or a disease that company A is interested in, and I'm doing research. I still think there's a conflict there, right? So saying not related to this talk, I just sort of wonder how that is that compliance. How does that work?
So that's typically, that's why, so our requests are for study specific. So that is a typical, if you have a relationship with a company, so you have a relationship with company A, that is disclosed, but it's not necessarily part of that study. So if you had something where that company provides a drug that is part of your research, but that's not where your interests lay, or that's where your relationship is personally, then that is where we have what we call it. Either your management plan would say you're clear, there's no conflicts to disclose for this, so it doesn't affect your relationship with that company, doesn't reflect in this research, or that's where we would have, say, in the consent form. So it may have that relationship may be disclosed. It wouldn't be that specific personal, what that person has said, but it would say Dr. Smith has a relationship with the company that is the provider of the study drug.
So you would still be able to do this?
You still would be able to do your research, yeah. Typically, we just ask for the disclosure so that we can add it into that information for the subject, so they are made aware of it, and also that we are made aware of it. So if there's something that comes into place later on, we don't want to be left out in the dark and say we can manage it. So again, conflicts of interest can be perceived, so it doesn't necessarily need to be a conflict, but if somebody might say, well, yeah, it's not this study drug, but it's that company, and that company will benefit if this drug does well in my study, that could be perceived by a subject as being a potential conflict. So we want to be aware of it and be able to manage it appropriately, let them know that yes, we are aware that this relates, but that we don't perceive that that's going to affect the study at all.
I think the thing that makes us, or at least people that I know most uncomfortable, and I'm a coordinator, so I get involved in a lot of this, is the way it's worded, do you or your immediate family or your second cousin first removed or the in-law or your dog or, and I'm kidding, but I'm not kidding.
Right.
I have no idea if my brother-in-law is investing in pharmaceuticals. I have no idea. So, are we going to be held responsible if he strikes it rich because one of the cardiac devices hits the market and makes him $1 million because he's invested? I wouldn't know.
Right, and it is something typical. So normally the requirement is immediate family members, so you would be more aware.
Yeah, but it's not the way it's written.
It isn't here, so we do ask for it here, and I do see some really interesting questions or answers to those questions. I have no idea what he does. We do ask for it to the best of your ability, knowledge. We don't want you to get involved in your...
So we're not going to research jail if we didn't know.
No.
I'm being funny and facetious, but you know what I mean? It's
yeah.
If we worry because in a court of law, they can get very nitpicky with something like that.
Right.
And how could you have not known that your sister's husband was this big investor in Pfizer and became a multimillionaire because of this new drug, on the scale of Lipitor or something?
Right.
It's no idea.
Right, and that's, yeah, so in that case, that's the reason why we're asking for things like that would be, say it does take off, and they did know, then people would think maybe you gave them inside information of how that study went at Thanksgiving table.
If my brother hits it that rich, I'm going to quit and just
Sorry, I wouldn't be here.
But it just makes us uncomfortable because it's the way it's written. It's written very detailed with very extended family. I can
It is very
understand us
extended.
being questioned if our husbands or wives or parents, but when you start to get to that extended family, it's like, I don't know.
But you don't know what you don't know, so.
Right, but it's a funny world we live in today, and perception scares me because perception is changing. The perception that we had 20 years ago is not the perception that we have today.
Right.
And I'm getting old and cantankerous, I guess, because it just scares me because the world is different than it was, and I don't know how the world perceives things is very far out.
It is, and that is, I think, the scary part of conflicts, because they can be perceived in one person's perception of that this is a conflict. It can be very different than somebody else's, but that's why we were asking for that broad, expanded, and especially I think someplace like Roanoke where everybody knows everybody. I've run into people, and I've only been here a couple of years, at the grocery store, I'm like, I know who you are. So I think that we try to get the most information just basically so that we are able to say, yes, we knew that this has that relationship. And it'd be similar to the previous question in that just disclosing it or having that information does not necessarily mean that there is a conflict. So it would be able to clear it or say that there is no conflict to disclose that you are aware of. But that makes it a little bit easier for us to be able to say that if we ask the question rather than just say, we don't think that they know what their cousin's doing. Any other questions?
Last question.
Yeah, no.
So for pharmaceutical trials where the PI doesn't sort of get some sort of direct financial reward, there is an account that's created where some money is due go and the PI can draw on. I've had patients who, I just stopped doing them for a little while because of this. I've had patients who've said, isn't that a conflict? Aren't you getting something from it? And my answer was no, but really it's yes. It's not going into my bank account. It's sitting somewhere here that I can draw onto. But I've actually had people say that to me. And because these things are declared on the Sunshine Act, which people can Google, I actually went back to it because I realized that it's not really kept up to date. The one that brought to me last was still like 2016, and it hadn't been updated since then. But they came and they said, look, you got paid X amount, and I was like, no, I didn't. And of course, you did in a way. That perception of that's a conflict. How is that? How would we? What's the best way to approach that? When you're sort of talking to people, and I find it difficult because there's this distrust nowadays. It's probably the best way I can explain it. In a way, it's like, well, you're getting paid for this anyway. And I find it very difficult nowadays to sort of. I don't know if anybody else sort of feels the same.
Yeah.
Well, a couple comments I'd have, Dr. Bancoli, is you're not getting paid above your regular salary. The money that's going into the overhead account can only be used for further research, education, or something that supports research. It can't be used, for a vacation or some benefit that benefits you personally.
But like you said, you're talking about perception, and I think that's the magic word that scares me. Because people probably misunderstand 90% of the time, but if they're perceiving it like that.
And it does include, so Sunshine Act, so the open database for CMS is coming up. That deadline is approaching rapidly. I just tried to do a webinar about it. yesterday, but they were having technical difficulties, so didn't get it. But it is behind. So we do have the information, yes, I think right now it may be on 2017, but it is usually a couple years behind before they can see it. And it is that general relationship. So you may see something under your name for Pfizer that is including your travel to your investigator meeting. So you may see something where they gave you thousands of dollars. You never saw any of that. That was for your travel reimbursement or for anything that was related to your actual study, but it's showing up as that. That is something physicians are able to go in and we do ask that you look at your funds. Again, it is difficult because they are so delayed, to make sure that they are accurate and they represent what you have, and you can do disagreements on there. So you can make notes saying, I didn't actually get this money. So that can help somewhat if somebody's savvy enough to go onto that website again and look up your name and find out that information that way. But it's also where we're asking for, a lot of times, the majority of our management plans is, even if you don't necessarily have that, it's not considered a conflict, but it is a disclosure. So I think that's where it would come into play, where you can say, yes, I have, they've given me money for other research projects to do with them, but that
In itself is not a conflict.
it's not a conflict, yes.
Any questions on the phone?
No.
Okay.
Well, thank you, everyone, and again,
Thanks,
you can reach me at the Organizational Integrity and Compliance Department. You can try to hunt me down, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Again, if it isn't, I get a lot of my questions that I get not only on research compliance or research misconduct, but conflicts of interest are those things where people are terrified. I get a lot of questions of, my wife attended this meeting that was accidentally done and they gave us dinner and now I've got to disclose it to everyone in the world. Those kind of things that I can try to calm you down and we can make sure that we have the proper...
Just wondering if we're in a paranoid state.
We are all there at this point. Including me sometimes. I'm like, is that a conflict? But it is really, again, important to remember just that it's okay to disclose and that it can be easily either cleared or we can be confirmed that there is actually no conflict, but that it is always better if we know ahead of time than finding out when the newspaper article comes out.
Thanks, Christina.
Thank you.
Thank you.